Okay, welcome to everyone, and a special welcome to Virginia. We're really glad you're with us and that you can, drawing on all your experience as a writer and as a peace activist and a social justice activist for many years. It's really good to have you leading our evening tonight and the discussion afterwards as to what the place of peace activism in a time of war. In Echo Hall, the novel that Sally mentioned before, there we've got 3 generations of experience in a fictional form, but based on a lot of research, I know, of activism in the First World War and the Second World War and subsequent wars. So it's really relevant to the situation we find ourselves in now with the present conflict in Ukraine, and what we can do, what can be done, where we put the focus in feeling that we are being active in the best possible way in the circumstances. So Virginia, we're delighted you're with us, and over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. It is really, really lovely to come back, and I just want to start by saying, Sally and you both, Anne, have both mentioned Echo Hall, and thanks to you, thanks to Abingdon Peace Group, Echo Hall became a book, because as you remember, I came and talked and I begged you for money, and you very kindly gave me some, like lots of other people did. And it was, I remember it was a really lovely evening. So it's lovely to be with you. And although I'm sorry not to be in person, because we have now moved from Oxford, it's actually quite easy to kind of do this in my office rather than have to drive a late night home from Abingdon. So although I would love to see you in person, it's quite nice to do it this way. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to start off by, I've got a sort of PowerPoint, because I thought that would be easier to prepare for you. Oh, damn. Oh, no. Sorry, I'm going to whiz through this and start again. This is trouble about doing PowerPoints. Never trust technology. I wanted to start here, and there you go. I want to start with that. So can everybody see that? So, okay. So the title that Sally gave me was Peace Activism in a Time of War, and I think it was a couple of weeks ago you wrote, it was right at the beginning when the Ukraine just had happened, that you wrote and asked me, and I'm really glad you did, because the day, you know, in the run up to it, it was kind of, there was this sort of unbelievable, is this actually going to happen? But the day it happened, I remember thinking, well, actually, I'm finding this really challenging. I'm finding it really challenging to be a peace activist in a time of war when I'm seeing Russian tanks go across the border to people who really, really don't want this to happen. And I know that our tanks and our guns and our weapons have done that in Iraq and Afghanistan and other places. But there was something of the fact that this occasion, we are not the aggressor, and we are seeing the victims, and the victims are coming across Europe. And it is also on mainland Europe, and I'm being very careful about that, because there's been an awful lot of racism in this war already. I think just because it's in mainland Europe does not make it any worse than any other war. But I think the fact that this time there are all sorts of more dangers because it's in mainland Europe, and the kind of the escalation of the possibilities of nuclear war, all of those things, it felt very challenging. The first challenge I had was, well, what would I do? I mean, it's very easy to be a pacifist when you're saying, we don't want you to go and bomb that country, we don't want you to invade that country. It's not so easy to be a pacifist when you're standing watching a country being invaded and saying, well, if it was my neighbour, what would I do? And though, you know, and I think we've all been really inspired by the Ukrainian people and their absolute resistance to Russia. And on the day of the war, Peace News tweeted, it's okay, you know, for us pacifists, because we can oppose Putin and we can oppose NATO, and that's okay. And I thought, oh yeah, well, okay, that's my position. I'm okay with that. I can feel okay with that. I still have this question about, well, if my neighbour was going out with a gun to defend me, how would I feel about that? I'm not sure how I would feel about that, because he's keeping me safe, or she's keeping me safe, and I'm the one saying I don't want to take up a gun. It's a challenge, and obviously I'm not in that situation, but I just think seeing people in that situation has been challenged. So I have been really inspired to see that in the middle of that war, there have been a lot of people taking up weapons, but there have also been a lot of people acting non-violently. And I think we all saw this image, I think this was from a couple of weeks ago, of this Ukrainian woman who handed seeds to the soldier and said, you know, these are plants for you to go and leave my home, or something like that. And she walked straight up, and the bravery to go up with the soldiers and guns who, you know, who could have shot her at, you know, any moment. I'm just really impressed, and it's inspiring, and so it makes me think it is possible to find a place to be a peace activist in time of war. But as Sally and Anne said, I've been asked to kind of look at some of the research that I looked at when I was writing Echo Hall. So what I'm doing in the rest of the talk is I'm going to focus on those 3 periods that I covered in Echo Hall, and then draw some parallels to now at the end. And one of the things that was really helpful was after I said to Sally I would do this talk, I was thinking, oh gosh, where's all my research? Because it was a long time ago and we've moved house and most of our things are still in boxes. And I looked at my shelves, and pretty much every book that I used to look at Echo Hall, for some reason, we've got about 1/10 of our books out, but they're all on the shelves. So I was able to go and look at them. And one of the books I want to mention to you, because I think it was one of the best books I've read in a long time, and I reviewed it for Peace News, and some of you might have read it. It's called Adam Hochschild, To End All Wars. And if you haven't read it, it's a really good read. But that, so as you've read it, I'm going to tell you some familiar stories, but I think sometimes hearing the story again is quite can be quite inspiring as well. So I'm going to start off actually before World War One, and the person I'm going to start off with is Emily Hobhouse. And the reason I'm starting there is that one of the early bits of Echo Hall, I had my character Rachel meet her future husband, and he was a Quaker, and I wanted to establish quite early on he's a bit of a rebellious sort, so her getting involved with him was going to be a challenge for her. And so I had read somewhere that Britain started the concentration camps, and it surprised me, but I thought, well, that's useful. And I did that thing, you kind of little nugget you do, sorry if you're a writer, you do this, you find something useful and you shove it in because you think it'll help what you're doing. But when I shared that draft with my sister, she said, what, Britain invented concentration camps? And I said, yeah, they did, I'm sure I read it somewhere in the Boer War. And she was a bit disbelieving, so I had to go away and do some more research to absolutely show to my sister, yes, honestly, we started the concentration camps. So my first peace activist that I'm going to find, I've lost my mouse, there you go, my mouse, is Emily Hobhouse. And Emily Hobhouse was a fairly wealthy single woman who had a social conscience, and so before the Boer War, she'd gone off to America and she'd helped miners to kind of who were having terrible social conditions. And when she came back, the Second Boer War was starting, and she got involved in South African relief. And so she went off at the turn of the century to South Africa, not to uncover any kind of great scandal, but to actually bring relief, which is obviously a lot of people do that in times of war. And when she got there, she got to meet the head of the High Commission, a chap called Alfred Milner. And she heard, just as she arrived, that Britain was locking civilians up in these concentration camps. And the reason they were called concentration camps was because people were being packed very, very closely together. And she wanted to go and see them. And Milner probably lived to regret letting her do that, because she didn't just go and see them. She saw them, was horrified, started writing letters home. And her letters to the Manchester Guardian were really influential in bringing it to the public's attention. Not only that, and this was something in the Hochschild book that I read again that I just thought was absolutely lovely, was when she got to the camps, she found a whole load of incompetent men in charge, and she had no time for them, no truck for them. She was a very formidable woman. And this this sentence that she said, you know, I rub salt in the sore places of their minds as I can. I just feel it's just a wonderful thing for us peace activists, that, you know, you're not going to let people get away with it. And she didn't, because she found people starving, she found families separated, she found ill health and a lot of death, lots and lots of corpses. So then she went back to England, and on the boat on the way home, by that time Milner had discovered what she was up to and was very unhappy about it. So he was on the same boat, and she challenged him on the boat to do something about it, and he wasn't having anything. But when she got off the boat, I think this really struck me as the difference between the establishment and being a peace activist. Was he got off the boat, got whisked off to the palace and became a knight. She got off the boat, went off doing what we all do, doing her talks like this, and got constantly heckled, was called a hysterical woman. People tried to suggest she was making up, that she was anti-patriotic, but, you know, she knew she was telling the truth, so she carried on. And when she tried to go back to South Africa, Milner was back by that time, and she got off the boat, and he sent the soldiers to put her straight back on the boat again. So she didn't get any much further, but she certainly caused a lot of rumpus. So the Boer War ended, and there were sort of two parallel things, and it feels like that happens quite a lot. There were sort of two parallel things going on. There was a build-up of arms in the sort of first decade of the 20th century, but at the same time there was also a huge hope in international peace. There've been a lot of international peace congresses and conferences, and the rise of socialism and the idea of the international workers movement was giving people a great deal of hope that, you know, the workers would stop a war from happening, because why would a worker in Germany want to fight a worker in Britain? Because it's not their fight, it's the fight of their bosses or the rich. And there was a real sense that might happen. And I think the other thing that was giving cause for hope was the suffrage movement, and the real strong sense that women would stop the war happening because of that unity that women were having. So but as the kind of turn century went on, that kind of drumbeat to war was getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So, and we all know, you know, Gavrila Princip killed the Archduke Ferdinand, and all the treaties that were in place meant that everybody, it was like dominoes across Europe, everybody had to get involved. But there was still a sort of hope that maybe it could be stopped. And I got these two pictures because I thought these are really familiar pictures to us. We've all been at Trafalgar Square for an anti-war demo, and we've all had our Caroline Lucas and our Jeremy Corbyn and our John McDonnell, and Charlotte Despard and Keir Hardie were two really prominent activists. Charlotte Despard's another formidable woman. You can see that in the picture. I think she just looks a tremendous woman. She was nearly 70 at this point, and she had grown up in wealth, rejected that wealth because from an early age she'd sort of seen injustice. And there was a lovely story of her in that book that I quoted from, of when she was a child, challenging the very idea of slavery and being sent to bed with no supper because she do something as terrible as challenge empire and slavery. So she actually went off from her family, went and lived in poor communities and served those communities, became involved in the suffrage movement, was an anti-war activist. Keir Hardie obviously founded the Independent Labour Party, and he really genuinely believed this idea that workers of the world would stop a war happening. And unfortunately, that didn't happen. And the reason that didn't happen was because for all the people who thought war was a bad thing, the kind of powerful wanted war to happen. And that drumbeat of war, which we see time and time and time again, meant that the popular mood changed very, very quickly. And this, I thought this phrase that Bertrand Russell had used was, war is hard to resist when the whole nation is in a state of violent collective excitement. And I think we have seen that, you know, every time we see war, and it's kind of characterizing itself at the moment with all these people who are going, oh yeah, we can live with a bit of a nuclear war, yeah, that'd be fine. There's just a core of people who just kind of enjoy it and just get visceral energy from this idea, particularly those people who are going to stay here safe at home and not in the forefront of it. But Bertrand Russell said it was very hard because for the early part of the war, he'd lost a lot of his like-minded people, and a lot of people he thought would be anti-war sort of suddenly became very pro-war, and it took him a couple of years before he could find a kind of movement of people to kind of be with. So in the early days of the war, being a peacemaker was pretty hard going, but they were there. The activists were there. Obviously, the Quakers. We all know, the it's kind of into the kind of Quaker religion, but other Christians too. And Fellowship of Reconciliation was founded on Cologne Station between Henry Hodgkin and Friedrich Sigmund Schultz, who was a German, and they very famously shook hands on the station and said, "We can't be at war with each other because we're brothers in Christ." Women and Labour left-wing people were also involved in war, but there was this big split, and it was really shocking in the suffrage movement because they'd been so united against the Lloyd George government. And then Emmeline Pankhurst and Christabel Pankhurst felt they would be better off supporting the war because it would get them their end in the end. So they completely changed where they had been on war and peace. Sylvia Pankhurst was horrified, and the family sort of split as a result of that. But there were lots of women who went with Emmeline and Christabel, and there were also lots who went with Sylvia. I mean, I'm characterising as a family. It wasn't just the family; it was just within the whole suffrage movement. Similarly, in the Labour movement, and I was sort of thinking there's a kind of a pattern with this. Because it happened to George Lazenby in World War II as well, and we've seen it happen to Jeremy Corbyn, that there's a core of Labour that are very anti-war, but the sort of mainstream Labour always sides with the government, and that we saw that happen here. And there was a very sad story of Keir Hardie passionately speaking against war while members of his backbench were singing the national anthem behind him, and that just feels very poignant and sad. And one of the reasons I think it was easy for the government to kind of quell the anti-war sentiments in the early days was because there was so little information from the front and the propaganda. And again, we're seeing that in Russia at the moment, that people are not believing what's happening in Ukraine because they have the information control is so much. But I think that really helped the government kind of keep the war as a good thing, and we were going to win it by Christmas. There was some hope for the peace movement with the famous Christmas truce, but obviously that just happened over Christmas, and nothing further happened from that. But still, there were attempts to keep working for peace, and Women's International League and Peace and Freedom, that very wonderful organisation we all know, had their first International Peace Congress in 1915 on the continent while war was happening. Unfortunately, none of the British women were able to get across the continent. They were stopped at Dover. But 2 or 3 women who were already there were able to attend. And it wasn't just in England and Britain that people were angry about women going to that conference, because 28 German women who went were then arrested when they came home. So there was anti-war sentiment everywhere, and it was not popular with the leadership. But I mean, this is kind of my characterisation. There's not a particular moment when it changed, but I think as the war went on and the effects of the war began to be seen in society, it became harder for the government to hold that line, because there's growing disillusionment with the amount of casualties, with the amount of injuries, people coming back from the front, never the same again. And whereas that, the heady days of August, when the whole villages were signing up, they were finding it harder and harder to get people to go to war, because people were beginning to say, well, why would I do that? My brother's gone and he's not come back. So that was when conscription became required. And that was introduced at the beginning of 1916, originally just for 18 to 41-year-olds. And then by May, it was married men as well. And by the end of the war, it was 51-year-olds, because they still, even with that, they couldn't get enough people. The right to CO status was already in law at this point, but it was very, very difficult to actually achieve conscientious objector status. And that was partly because the tribunals that made the decisions were all led by military, who had no interest in letting anybody off the hook. So understandably, conscription ended up with 2.3 million men being recruited. However, 20,000 men did refuse, and of those numbers, 1,500 went to jail. 13,000 had work of national importance. 5,000 were non-combatant roles, and there was a tiny handful of people who had CO status. But the anti-war movement kind of was growing in strength, and things like the Somme really helped that, you know, in a horrible way. You know, when a terrible atrocity happens and a really bad battle happens that was really badly managed and loss of life, it kind of gave cause to the peace movement. And peace activists were gradually being seen as quite dangerous, and they were harassed and they were raided and they were infiltrated. I think we probably all know the story of the Richmond 16, but it's a good story to tell, and I think it's symbolic to me of kind of the bravery of conscientious objection, because most of the conscientious objectors were sent to jail, or the ones that, you know, refused combatant roles were sent to jail, and they were sentenced to hard labour. But if you were conscientious objector in France, you would face a death penalty because you were seen as a deserter. And the military wanted to make an example of these men. So 16 of the men in Richmond were sent over to France. And luckily for them, they were, well, not luckily for them, they were a very tight group. They managed to get their message across that they were being sent to France by somebody throwing a message out of the train, and a union worker picked it up and got it to the non-conscription fellowship. One of their member, Bert Bocklesby, was very clever, and he managed to get a message out to exactly where they were, because the government had sort of postcards with sort of 6 messages, standard messages, to get messages home past the censor. And so what Bert Bocklesby did was he scored off 4 of them, and he left 2 sentences. One said, "I'm being sent to the base," and the other said, "I've received no letter from you in a long time." And he crossed out all the letters that he didn't want, and what he ended up with was saying, "I am being sent to B ... OU ... long." So people knew they were in Boulogne, and that helped the non-conscription fellowship, and Bertrand Russell went with them as well, to go to Asquith, the Prime Minister, and say, "You can't do this." And they basically just said, "If you let these men die because they oppose war, that will be on you, and it'll be terrible." He didn't give them any. He said he knew nothing about it. He didn't give them any reason to believe that he had paid attention, but we now know, because of kind of war records, that he actually then wrote to General Haig and said, "You cannot kill these men." So basically that action by the men letting people know where they were, and the non-conscription fellowship going and challenging the Prime Minister, saved their lives. So peace activism really can make a difference. But the army, being the army, still toyed with them. So they were actually pulled out on parade and told they'd been sentenced to death before being told the sentence had been commuted. So they're very, very cruel. And they were all sentenced to about 10 years, but in fact, they were all out by about 1919 and survived the war. Meanwhile, other people were kind of doing things to protest against the war. Bertrand Russell did a very famous lecture tour in Wales, and had sort of thousands of people turning up. When that finished, he wanted to go off to Scotland and the North, but the powers that be refused to let him. They said he could lecture on maths, but he wasn't allowed to lecture on politics. So he wasn't able to do his lecture. Our friend Emily Hobhouse absolutely tremendously went to Berlin, and I just think that's just incredible. She did that in 1917. She crossed across Europe, infuriated the establishment that she did that. She was a bit naive. She went and she just sort of spoke to the German foreign minister she'd met earlier in her career. He told her, you know, that they weren't doing terrible things, and she believed they weren't as bad as what happened in the Boer War. So she was much more sympathetic to them than she probably should have been. But nonetheless, it was a really powerful thing symbolically to do. And when she came back, she lobbied the government, who really didn't give her the time of day. But one of the things that she asked for, they didn't acknowledge it came from her, but was to organise prisoner exchange, and that happened as a result of her trip. So although she didn't get what she wanted, she did actually achieve something by doing that. But the idea of peace activism was considered to be really terrible and not helpful to the war effort. So the government was constantly looking at ways to damage the peace movement. And we've seen that time and time again as well, people being slandered and harassed and put on trial for things that they didn't do. One of those was a woman called Alice Wilden, and she and her daughters, Hetty and I've written that down somewhere, Hetty and Winnie, and their son-in-law Alf, were arrested in 1917 for a plot where it was a completely ludicrous plot where they were supposed to be poisoning Lloyd George and the War Cabinet. And the person who gave evidence was somebody who'd infiltrated their community, because they would hide people who were resisting war and didn't want to kind of go to court, or people who and they produced homes for conscience objectors who were known about. So they had a terribly unjust trial where the judge was completely biased. The key witness against them didn't show up, but they accepted his evidence in his absence. The judge was kind of taking the prosecutor's case and sort of described them as kind of monsters, basically, and they were sentenced to 10 years in jail. There was a lot of negative publicity because of that, and Alice Wilden went on strike and so was eventually released. She went on hunger strike and she was eventually released. By the end of the war, Bertrand Russell was jailed for some writing that he did, saying that American troops might end up doing strike breaking, and they used it as an excuse to say he was inciting against war effort. One lovely story, again, this was from the Adam Hochschild book, but I thought it was absolutely beautiful, was that the non-conscription fellowship press, they were constantly shutting it down, and they'd shut it down, they'd find somewhere else, they'd shut it down, and they'd find somewhere else. And eventually they ran out of places, but unionists in the Daily Mail said you could use Daily Mail presses. So while the Daily Mail was putting out all this war effort, they didn't know, but unbeknownst to them, the NCF was using it to print all their pamphlets. And I thought that was a lovely bit of subversion. Really good story. So the war came to the end, as wars do. And again, there was a sort of time post-war where the possibilities for peace seemed to be, really pertinent. Once the war was over and people came home, and a lot of men didn't come home, a lot of the people who came home obviously were deeply, deeply damaged, whether physically or mentally. And so there was a really strong anti-war sentiment in the country. And again, in that Hochschild book, something I didn't know happened was he poignantly said, the idea of Remembrance Day came obviously from World War I, but when it first happened, it was considered a sort of a tragedy, and women would stand on the streets weeping silently on Remembrance Day. I mean, that just seems really powerful to me, and kind of like potent of a society affected by war, and so far from how we see remembrance now. And again, as the beginning of World War I started some really, really important peace organisations. Between the wars, some new ones grew up. So War Resisters International, to kind of strengthen the CO movement, had really taken off in World War I. The Peace Pledge Union, to kind of find ways of getting, policies about peace out there, and peace protests. Peace News, which we still love and use today, and the White Poppy movement, which obviously was a direct response to the Hague poppies, and the idea that the White Poppy should be a remembrance for no war, not a remembrance to glorify war, as the Hague poppy had become associated with. And obviously the other key thing that happened in this period, which was hopeful for people who believed in peace, was Gandhi's salt marches and his non-violence movement. And I think it was kind of it's interesting if you look at it back historically, we all think of that as a great success, but actually originally it felt like it had failed, because they had made all these marches and they had resisted the government, the British government, but they didn't get any of their aims. However, what they did do was they had shown the horrors of the empire to the world, and so they really tarnished the reputation of the British government, which meant that although they didn't see the end of the British Empire at the time they did the salt marches, that was where the seed of that was sown, and it was a very inspiring time. So again, there was a sense for a while that maybe war could be avoided, but as the 30s went on and the rise of fascism happened, again the drums for war beat, and we all know the arms companies love it and they kind of stir it up, and but there was plenty of reasons why people were feeling that war was inevitable. And it meant that there were lots more challenges to peacemaking in World War II than I think there were in World War I. one of the challenges was the Spanish Civil War really inspired the left wing in this country, and a lot of former pacifists joined the resistance to fascism in the Spanish Civil War because they felt they had to take arms for their brothers and sisters, and that meant that they were much more likely to support World War II when that happened. Germany under Hitler was a real threat. It was a threat not just to Germany's neighbours, but it was a threat to our country, and that's why I suppose why the kind of Ukrainian situation resonates with me a bit, because I've always struggled with World War II, and like how could you be a pacifist in World War II? It's quite a hard question to answer. There's also the jingoism that I've mentioned before that kind of comes with the kind of rise to war. And then the thing that was different about World War II and World War I was that conscription came from the beginning. They didn't wait for it. They just thought, no, in order to make this war happen, we're going to have to put conscription in from the beginning. And although there were lots of people willing to join up, they wanted to make sure that they didn't have the resistance. And also women for the first time were conscripted as well. So it was a harder ask to be a peace activist at this time. And you also get, although this quote from George Orwell was from later in the war, I think it's a useful one to look at, because it's was a sentiment that he kind of had throughout the war, and I think it was a challenge for peace activists. He said pacifism is objectively pro-facet. That's elementary common sense. If you hamper the war effort on one side, you automatically help out that of the other. Nor is there any real way of remaining outside such a war as the present one. In practice, he that is not with me is against me. Now, I can sort of see why he came up with that. It was a very difficult war to be out of, but the idea that you are fascist if you are pacifist is ridiculous. I mean, one of the things I think that kind of helped fuel that was that because of Mosley's movement was anti the war in Germany, it was hard for the peace movement to kind of separate themselves off from that. And I think the other thing that I think made it harder as well was that Gandhi at one point talked about the Jewish people just non-violently resisting Hitler, and that just clearly wasn't going to happen because of the way that Hitler was targeting the Jewish community. So that came across as quite naive, I think. Nonetheless, there was a sense that I've jumped a slide and I can't go back on this one. I do apologise, but I will read what that slide was saying. Was that Christopher Isherwood, just before the start of the war, gathered some peacemakers together, peace activists together, and said, well, what can we do? What should we do? The question he asked was, what should pacifists do? And the four things that they came up with were refuse to fight, humanitarian aid, resist aggression, and demonstrate. And again, if we think about what it challenges for us today, I think that is something that I can still think works today. Refuse to fight, humanitarian aid, resist aggression, demonstrate. And people did refuse to fight. One of the things that I think was really helpful in World War II was that this time there was a sense, Neville Chamberlain quote, people recognised after World War I that actually there was a moral choice for non-conscription. So there was a provision made in conscription, the Act for the Right to be a CO on moral grounds. Tribunals were non-military, which did mean that you didn't have that kind of military pressure to kind of the lack of understanding of the civilian. However, in London, they found that tribunals tended to be more severe, particularly during the Blitz when people were feeling under attack. Because the Conscription Act allowed for the right to CO on moral grounds, it did mean that there were 6,000 registered COs and 2,000 women. I couldn't find a figure for how many people went to jail, but people did go to jail. So I've just kind of cited a few examples of people who refused to fight. Two in Britain and one very famous one in Austria. So Sidney Greaves was a Quaker, and he went to the tribunal and told them he was a Christian. It was against his beliefs, and asked for CO status. It was refused. He said, and basically he said they just didn't really want to listen. They just had made their mind up before he went. So he was sent to 6 months in Wormwood Scrubs. And when he went there, he said that it was quite tough, probably not as hard as the World War I COs. But one thing that he found very very demoralizing was that the warders had such a lack of respect for him, and they respected the violent criminals much more. And he called it a sort of subdued patriotic bias. Another person who went to Wormer Scrubs was an actor called David Markham, and he was there not for very long because he happened to be lucky enough to have a celebrity fan in Queen Mary, who was Queen Mother at the time, and so she basically got him out because she thought he shouldn't be in prison, and so he then went to work for the Forestry Commission and moved to a country village with his wife. And one of the things that they both experienced was a lot of negativity. Conchies were not, we didn't have the white feather movement in World War II, but Conchies were seen as kind of cowards and not helping the rest of the community. But interestingly enough, David Markham's wife said that in an interview that some of the older people in the village who'd experienced World War I were actually much more generous and understanding of why you might resist war. And it was the people who hadn't experienced war before who were less generous. And the last person on that list is, again, probably very well known, Franz Jägerstätter. And there was a very good film. And in fact, Anne and I bumped into each other at the film showing a few months before lockdown, A Hidden Life by Terence Malick, which I highly recommend. Franz Jägerstätter is somebody who's very important to me and my husband Chris, because he's a Catholic like us. He was Catholic, and he believed it was wrong to fight, and he had to resist absolutely everybody around him, because the whole community, apart from his wife, thought he should go to war. His parish priest told him he should go to war. Everybody begged him to go to war, and he refused because he felt God, because he was coming from a position of Christianity, he felt God didn't want him to go to war. And he also didn't feel that it wasn't just about war, it was also fighting for the German-Austrian side was a really wrong thing to do. And he was jailed, and he was eventually killed for it. And why I think Chris and I found that story so moving was that his wife Francesca continued to live in the village even though she was greatly criticised for his actions, and she raised their 3 children on their own, and it was just a really poignant story about peace activism. And he never believed anybody would ever know that he did it, but he just still felt it was important to do. And it was only in the 60s when Howard Zinn found the story that his story became well known, and he is very well known now. So it's a sort of a symbol that you don't know what the impact of your peacemaking will be, and he obviously paid the worst price for it. In World War II, people who humanitarian aid, and that's something that the Quakers did really well and continue to do very well. So there was a War Committee Relief and helping evacuees, and the Friends Ambulance Committee, which was reprising what they did in World War I and helping out the ambulances. One of the things I think that gets missed in World War II is how much civil disobedience went along in occupied countries and in Germany itself. So there was a lot of resisting the aggressor. Sophie and Hans Scholl, who led the White Rose movement, were killed right at the beginning of the war for anti-war protests. They were very young and very, very inspirational, but very tragic. Andrei and Magda Trocmé, who survived the war, managed to hide thousands of Jewish people in the south of France, and they actually told the Germans they were hiding them, but said we won't tell you where they were, and somehow got away with it. I don't know how they did. That's incredible to me. In Denmark, there was a lot of non-violent resistance to the Germans, and the Danish Peace Academy managed to get the majority of Jewish people in the country out to Sweden, and that was partly because Sweden and Denmark are so close, they were able to get them across the sea, but they managed to do that. In Netherlands, there was a strike against conscription of Dutch soldiers. Netherlands and Norway, there was non-cooperation of doctors' professional associations, and in Belgium, university teaching went on in secret. So all of this was going on while people were occupied, which I think is incredible. And here, the sort of fourth thing that Isherwood's friends suggested was demonstrate. And I found it very hard. I could not find a single picture of demonstrations that happened in World War II. I know they did happen, but I couldn't find a picture of them. What I did find was this quote from Vera Brittain, who's pictured, and she led the sort of campaign against Bomber Harris's bombing of Dresden and other places where they basically carpet bombed to destroy the morale of people, and they deliberately knew they were targeting civilian populations, just as Putin has done in Ukraine. Nothing Putin is doing has not been done by Britain before. It was kept very, very quiet. People were not saying that, were not saying that, but Vera Britton's pamphlet "Seeds of Chaos" really made that clear, that was what was happening. And I know that there were protests about that, but I couldn't find a picture of it. Peace-led union-led protests, and often were arrested, particularly if people were arrested for selling peace news. So demonstrations were happening, but I think that war generally was a harder war to be a peace activist in, because Hitler was seen as such an evil leader, and so it was harder, I think, for peace activists to maintain their position. But maintain their position they did, and I think that shows that we can, whatever the circumstances, always speak the truth as we see it. So obviously, between after World War II, a lot of peace movements developed again. So we got Pax Christi International, we got CND, we got Campaign Against the Arms Trade, and there were peace protests, Vietnam and the Falklands War. So peace processing became bigger, and because there was no longer conscription, when we went to war with Falklands, there was no conscription movement, but there were actions and vigils against against the war. And this leads me to the last war that I'm going to talk about in relation to the book. That's the third war in Echo Hall, the first two being World War I and World War II. And I chose this in Echo Hall because the Gulf War, I mean, I was a teenager when the Falklands happened, and I was kind of naturally anti-war, but I had a period after that where I really didn't think about it very much. And it was during the Gulf War that my kind of proper life as a peace activist began, because I remember seeing that kind of rush to war, that jingoism, and all this kind of, it was like we're going to get the old band back together again, it's the Allies again. And there was all this language of it. This is like World War II, Saddam Hussein's the next Hitler, we've got to defend against the aggressor. And I don't know what it was that made me suddenly think, I found myself getting swept up in it, even though I didn't quite believe it. And I managed to stop myself and take a sort of step back and go, actually, this isn't true, what we're being told. And I think one of the things that I find really interesting, I think it was basically Vietnam sort of started this idea of worldwide protest to war, but it really took off in the Gulf War. And there were protests all over the world. And this one, I think, is one in America, because I couldn't find one for Britain. But the other thing I think that was really interesting was the Gulf War peace team, where 73 people from 15 countries set their camp up on the Iraq border with Saudi as a witness to peace. And they were eventually moved and returned to the country. And there's been some criticism of it, as it didn't really achieve very much, but as a symbolic act of people saying, we are here to stop war and to witness it's happening, but to try and stop it by just our presence. It was an attempt to do something dramatic. I didn't realise until I was looking this up today that there were also lots of strikes in various countries, in Spain and Germany and Italy, against the war. There were lots of blockades, student boycotts in lots of places. And there was resistance in the military. So again, this isn't something I was aware of until I looked at it today, but of the 410 reservists who were called up, only 314 turned up, and at least 25 of those actually publicly refused. And the end of the first phase of the war, there was a mass desertion of the Iraqi army, which allowed the war to come to an end, because Saddam Hussein just couldn't carry on without that. So that's kind of that sort of thread of peace activists refusing to fight has sort of carried on to this day. And if anyone follows the work of War Resisters International, every conflict in the world, there's always somewhere someone is resisting war. And in the 30 years since 1991, we've seen a lot of wars, and we've seen a lot of anti-war work. So immediately after this war, the sanctions movement, the anti-sanctions movement kicked into gear, and people broke the sanctions deliberately to try and highlight the fact of what it was doing to ordinary Iraqis. We had wars in the Balkans, we had wars in Sierra Leone, Kosovo, 9/11, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, Yemen. We've had people campaigning against the arms trade in all of those places. We've had East Timor and Seeds Hope, the Ploughshares Action that stopped the warplane going to East Timor. There have been thousands and thousands of people millions of people who protested war. So every time there is war, there's been protests that goes alongside it. And one of the things I think, again, looking back over the kind of history of this kind of last of 120 years, is there are it seems to me that there are three core groups you can always rely on to protest against war. You can always rely on religious people, particularly Quakers, and often Christians, but now, you know, interfaith groups as well, Muslims and Hindus and Jewish people against war. You can always rely on women's groups. There's always a strong feminist strand of women who are opposed to war. And you can always rely on people on the left to oppose war, and kind of progressive left green organisations. And together, here and across the world, we make connections. We can very rarely stop a war, particularly once a war is in place, but we can do stuff. Somebody I didn't mention early on was in World War II as a refusenik was Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was a religious man who's a priest. And I've moved forward. Apologies, I've just managed to do something on my slide, so I'll just do that. There you go, for my last slide. That Dietrich Bonhoeffer resisted war and was a pacifist for a long time, but he ended up believing that he should kill Hitler, and was killed for that, although he never obviously killed Hitler. One of the things he sort of said was, we have to put a spoke in the wheel to stop the wheel happening, and that feels to me what we do as pacifists. So that question that Christopher Isherwood asked way back in 1939, what shall we pacifists do? It seems to me to be still pertinent today. We should refuse to fight. We should resist the aggressor. We should practice humanitarian aid. We should demonstrate. And some of these pictures are recent, including this morning, you guys in Abingdon doing that very thing of demonstrating. We saw last night a woman who invaded the Russian TV demonstrating, and a wonderful survivor of Stalingrad demonstrating. We've seen the picture of refugees being welcomed in Poland, and that picture of the people in the village who stood down in front of the tanks to try and stop them going into a nuclear war. All of the nuclear site, all of those things are people doing them right now, kind of on the back of all those people we've talked about. And to me, that's what we pacifists should do. We should carry on with that message, and we should learn from each other. And I think the last thing I was to say that what shall we pacifists do is that we should also tell the truth, because we know truth is lost in war. And one of the things they try to do to us time and time again is they try and tell us we are comforting the enemy if we ever dare criticize our side. And I think one of the most powerful things we can be doing at the moment is to say, you know, yes, Putin is the aggressor. We absolutely condemn Putin. But the West helped create this situation by the expansion of NATO. That doesn't mean that a lot of people who are close to Russia now, like Finland and like Ukraine themselves, wouldn't feel safer in NATO and want to join. And we don't deny that. But the fact is that no war starts from just an aggressive action. Something has happened before to kind of create that action. We should acknowledge that, because a way we can stop war happening is to stop those moments of creating reasons for people to go to war. So I think I'll probably stop there, because I'm sure you've got lots you want to talk about. But yeah, I think I'll stop there. You're on mute, Anne.
Yeah, that was a tour de force, a sort of sweep across the last 100 years in all the different war situations, of the different ways that the war machine has been at least. I love that quotation from Dietrich Bonhoeffer about putting the spoke in the wheel, not able to stop it completely, but to put the spoke in the wheel. And also that witness of Franz Jägerstätter of not even being sure that what he was doing would ever be known or would make any difference. And yet it sowed that seed which led on to so much more. And his standing up for what he believed in, resisting, had a legacy which he was completely unaware of and which was rich. So thank you very much for all that you have given us to mull over, and we'll throw it open to anyone who wants to comment, to question, to add any point to what Virginia has said. Tony.
This particular situation is really new in that, well, we're talking to each other by Zoom, that we've been watching people emerging from Ukraine. We've seen children clutching their toys as evacuees. So it becomes terribly emotional and real. And that's something that could be motivated. Well, it could motivate people to peace, say, oh God, we mustn't let this happen again. But on the other hand, the people are going to say to Russia, you know, that people are sort of judged as a group. So although there are objections to, and there have been brave acts by people, there's that journalist who spoke out yesterday. But I suppose, how do you resist, or how do you contain people's sense of outrage without getting them into a sort of war fever frenzy? I don't know if that's a question, but it sort of complicates the matters so much, I think.
Well, I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think one of the things, I've been sort of thinking about is possibly this is the first war by social media. I mean, by that I mean we know it's happening in other places, and we have been constantly at war for the last 20 years. This is not a new, we're not just suddenly at war. We have been at war, and we are at war through Yemen and through Libya and through Israel. Those wars are happening, and the kind of things we're seeing in Ukraine are happening on the ground in Palestine, in Yemen all the time. And they're not getting the same kind of level of outrage, which in itself is a hugely racist thing. But I think one of the reasons why is because we've actually sort of seen it's from day one. A lot of these other things have been around for quite a while, and so it's easy to sort of forget. But we have seen from day one the build up of the troops at the Russian border. Everybody knew when people were sharing on Twitter a week or so before Russia invaded, saying this is a false flag from Russia. They're giving them an excuse to go over the border. We knew it was going to happen, and there's something about the immediacy of social media that brings it into our living rooms in a way that TV used to be, but I think now social media does it. And I think in terms of kind of stopping people's outrage, I mean, I think it is that human thing of sort of saying, well, one, look to the people in Russia who are standing up, because they are, and the people who aren't standing up are being lied to. And we all know what that's like, because we've been lied to by our government. And I think that, the best example is the 45-minute lie about Saddam Hussein's weapons, because that is so documented. We were told we were going to war because we were 45 minutes away from a missile from Saddam Hussein, which has been absolutely proved in the public domain to be a total lie. And I think if you can start making connections with what we've done and what other people have done, then I think you kind of lessen that. I think the other thing is just, is to point out, lots of Ukrainian people are doing, is the Ukrainian people are really saying very clearly to the Russian people, this is not, we don't want to be at war with you, and actually this is what your government are doing to us. And I think, we should be taking our example from them, and the fact that they are, by and large, I mean, I think, I had problems with the fact that they paraded some Russians on telly. I think no prisoner of war should be put on telly, but apparently they are getting phones. The first thing they're doing to Russian soldiers is giving them a phone, saying phone home and tell them your family you're safe. That's an incredibly humane thing to do in a war situation. And I think, if they can do that to the person who's come into their country with guns and weapons and bombed them, then I think we as the witnesses can be saying, well, we don't have to be belligerent to the Russian people, because it's not the Russian people, it's their government, and we should be distinguishing. And I think that would be always the way. It's like, I don't hold Israelis responsible for what happens to Palestine. I hold the Israeli government responsible. I don't hold the Saudi people responsible for what's happening in Yemen. I hold the Saudi government. And I think that's a way to kind of do it. And I also think, if you're outraged about this and you're not outraged by Yemen and you're not outraged by Palestine, why aren't you? Is another kind of way to go with that conversation.
David.
Thank you. I was heartened to see on BBC just before we started, they were doing a comparison between sort of complete media frenzy of Ukraine compared to the sort of basic silence over the middle. And of course, it's white faces and Christians and so on, and that you can put yourself in their place more easily than, well, that's just a foreigner and I don't have any connection with him. And I'm sure that, out of their elbow for the BBC to do that. I don't have anything else to say.
Thank you, David. Yeah, I couldn't help but be struck by the overwhelming response to Ukrainian refugees. It's as though that the Afghan refugees and the Syrian refugees have been almost airbrushed out, and there are the resettlement scheme of the Afghan refugees, to whom we owed an enormous debt because they were working as interpreters, many of which we were unable to get out, but they are still holed up in hotels, even those that managed to come here. So there's a kind of danger, I feel, in forgetting the other parallel conflict situations and the refugees that have come from that conflict, in the understandable, overwhelming empathy with Ukrainian people.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true, and because actually I was thinking back, I think there is an inherent racism in the way it's all reported, but actually if you think back to Syria, when the whole refugees welcome started, there was the same sort of sense of people saying, the governments weren't, but people were saying, and for me a really striking thing that happened around that time, and it was absolutely critical, which is again shows how small actions can change things, was Angela Merkel was on live television, and she was interviewed she was challenged by a child who was a refugee, who's saying, why can't I stay here? And it was a really powerful moment. I don't know if anyone saw it. It was a really powerful thing, and Angela Merkel kind of had the grace to look a bit embarrassed, and she came out with some rubbish about, well, we just don't have the resources, dear, sort of thing. But she was really, you could see she was really challenged by it. And then the Syrian wave of refugees came very soon after that, and Germany led the way in, so all those scenes we've sort of seen of people being greeted in Poland, the buggies on the platform and people kind of saying, come, there's similar pictures of refugees coming into Hamburg and Frankfurt, and people on the street, saying you're really welcome and giving them hugs and you're safe now, and so I think there is this human instinct to help, and I think people do want to help. And I think, there was with Afghanistan, people were really disgusted at the government because they saw that sort of thing. But I think each one overwhelms the next one, and it's up to us. Something we can do, again, as kind of telling truth, is making these connections, saying we have responsibility to all these people. And one thing I think we could do really helpfully here is challenge that racist narrative, because for the last 30 odd years, refugees have been seen a blight on society, and they've been seen as, you know, not like us, and, you know, and but maybe one way of using the fact that you know, the like they look like us rhetoric, we could actually use that to say, well, they're no less, you know, Syrian refugees and Palestinian refugees and Afghanistan refugees are no less like us, and they've had exactly the same experience, and they were living equally good lives that have been disrupted. So we have a responsibility, all of those. And I do think that is changing a little bit as well, because I did see a YouGov poll that gave me heart, which suggested that people have more positive attitudes to refugees than they have had for a long time. So I think that's, you know, and again, you know, to counter the kind of the awful boats and, you know, on the channel and stopping people crossing the channel, I think that this is a moment we can challenge that as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Sally.
Yeah, there are two things going through my mind. I was really pleased to hear you say that one thing we can do is sort of challenge the demonization of the Russian people, you know, make the distinction between the people and their government. Somebody sent me a link today, Judith Baker sent me a link today. Apparently there was a burglary in the Russian Orthodox Church in Oxford today. You know, that it was broken into and messed up, and a lot of collections of things they were collecting for Ukrainian refugees were stolen. And that sort of thing, I think we need to really speak out against. But the other strand was talking about telling the truth. And I really agree with you. I mean, I've been really trying to sort of amplify messages that come, you know, from everyone, everywhere, really. But it's quite difficult sometimes to know what the truth is. At the very start of the invasion, I read somewhere that the Ukraine government had actually reneged on the Minsk agreement, which was that they were going to give autonomy to the Donbass region, and that they were suppressing the Russian language. And I don't know if that's true, and I don't know how you tell whether that's true. I don't know if anyone else had heard either of those things.
I have heard that, and I think I'm trying to sort of do research. I mean, I think it's a question of finding those organisations you think you can trust. And I think an organisation I really trust is Open Democracy. I think they tend to look at the world in very dispassionate terms, and they tend to have good old-fashioned German journalism. I don't know that they've written about Donbass, but I definitely have seen that. And I think one of the things that's a bit tricky with Ukraine is that before Zelensky, my understanding is that they did have some, they were pro-Russian, but they've also been pro-Western. You know, I think Russia and the West have been playing games with who's in charge of the country. But Zelensky seems to have been actually a genuine independent, from what I can understand. And it's one of those things is that some of the stuff he's inherited has been from predecessors, I think. So I think there has been suppression of the Russian language in Donbass. And I tell you who I read a really interesting article by is Peter Hitchens, who is not somebody I would normally recommend, but he was quoting his experience of going to Ukraine about 10 years ago. And he'd written an article where he said you could actually see this was going to happen. And that the Ukraine was turning to the West, and but there were sort of Russian sort of warships nearby, and there was this kind of tension between the two, and that it was a recipe for trouble, and that some of the Ukrainians who were in charge at that point were not paying due respect to the Russian people in their midst. So I get the impression that Zelensky hasn't been on that kind of pattern. But whether that's true or not, whether that's just wishful thinking, I don't know. But it is certainly something I think we all need to kind of research and look a bit more at. But I certainly think there's some truth in it. I mean, one of the other things I think there's some truth in, but I had a very interesting debate with a former colleague about recently, was that in Donbass there is a militia that is called the Azov militia, and they're definitely neo-Nazis, and they've got loads of weapons, and the West have given them a load. And it's like the person I was having the argument with was saying, well, if the Russian tanks are coming through, you want whoever is going to defend you. And I was saying, yes, but do you really want to be defended by neo-Nazis? I'm not sure that's who you want, because also we also know from Libya and from Syria and from Iraq is if you lose whoever's in charge and there's a power vacuum, that's when those militia can take over. And so, the West arming militia like that is really, really dangerous, even if we think it's going to help in the short term. So yeah, I think it's not quite clear cut. I mean, I think it is, this is a terrible act of aggression, but there's always causes and reasons and things like that. I would also counter that with there is the counter argument to that is that Russia has always had a plan for a greater Russia, and Putin has got an ally who has had a roadmap to that for the last 20 years, and everything that Putin has done follows that roadmap, which is just kind of getting all these different bets back and basically growing and destabilizing the West and getting things like Brexit and destabilizing the US, all of the things that Putin has done. So yeah, it's complicated, I think.
Mike.
Well, Zelensky, I believe, his first language is Russian. So there's a certain implausibility, and also an awful lot of the Ukrainian, straight down the line, anti-Putinists are Russian speakers. I've got two doors down, I've got a neighbor who is a Russian-speaking Ukrainian. I'd be very surprised if she was sitting at home applauding Putin at the moment. There are very many people who speak Russian as their first language. I imagine learning Ukrainian is really not that difficult, but close language, it takes an effort. But they seem very good at learning languages when you see them on the telly, don't you? Sorry, I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely true. And I think one of the things that I think is sad and powerful and hopeful and hard is that there is this sense both from the people in Russia who are saying we don't want to be at war, and the people in Ukraine who are saying we don't want the war, is actually how connected the two countries are. And the hopeful thing is people saying, look, reaching out to their Russian brothers and sisters saying, get rid of your government or get your government to stop this. The hard thing is how deep-rooted the propaganda is, and the stories you kind of keep seeing of families who, people are ringing up their mothers and the mother saying there's no war, it's fine, and they're saying I'm literally being shelled by the Ukrainians, and our army wouldn't commit war crimes, our army wouldn't bomb, and that feels really familiar, doesn't it? It's like, I mean, Putin's taken it to the next level, but we've been told all those lies ourselves over here. So I think it gives me hope that those conversations are going on, but that is a big uphill battle because of the propaganda that Russian people are facing, I think.
Yeah. Anyone else? Carrie.
I just wanted to draw attention to a really good article that probably some of you have seen today, called "Was Putin's War in Ukraine Inevitable?" It was in the long read in The Guardian, and I thought was a very, very easily readable and very comprehensive look at the history that's led up to this war. If you haven't seen it, it is very interesting, and it is on Salisbury CND's website if you want to read it. The other thing I wanted just to sort of get your thoughts on was this war is totally horrific to witness and live through, but if it ends without taking the whole of humanity with it, there seems to be a danger that one of the effects will be that countries will sort of knee-jerk to say, oh gosh, we need to spend more on the military, and we're already seeing that huge change in Germany's approach to military spending. And that seems to be one possible implication, that in a post-Ukraine war world, there will be even more investment in military weapons. And if that does happen, there's a terrible inevitability that it can only lead to more war. You know, it seems an absolutely logical end to people believing that there is a military solution to our differences.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a classic. You know, Chris, as you know, I think you know my husband Chris runs Drone Wars UK and used to work with Cat, and he tweeted when he saw that thing about Germany. He tweeted, "Now thrive the armourers," and you know, and you know, go way back to where we started from. You know, George Bernard Shaw wrote Major Barber at the turn of last century. You know, an anti-arms trade play. You know, the armourers were busy selling their weapons, hawking them around Europe at the beginning of World War One, and they did the same between the wars. You know, the very first time I went to the Cat office and did some research at Cat, one of the things I sort of learned from Cat was, you know, that's how conflicts begin to be fueled, because the arms companies go to one side and say, yay, you've got a dangerous enemy over there, you want this weapon, and then they go to the other side and, oh, we've just sold that country those weapons, you want that weapon too. You know, when governments give them a kind of in, that, you know, they're all laughing, and somebody always is making money from war somewhere. So yes, it does definitely make it more dangerous, and I think it's, again, that's our job as peace activists, is to, you know, it's not just during the war, it's after the war that sometimes the really good work and the really important work can happen. I saw a counter argument to that, a more hopeful essay, which I thought was quite interesting, about this actually might be the last time somebody tries to do a war like this, because the costs to Russia are immense. I mean, the costs to us are getting to be quite high, and it is really, you know, you're already seeing people trying to damage the fossil-free movement with this as well, and saying we can't get to net zero. So it's kind of challenging climate change. But it was quite a, I can't even remember who wrote the article, but it was quite a persuasive argument that, you know, Putin has gone in with an army that's not fit for purpose, that's not properly resourced and logistic. Although he's got all these soldiers, it's just been logistically a nightmare. He has got the air power, and obviously he can bomb these cities. But the implication for Russia, even though the global South and China are not backing them, but not sort of sanctioning them, but what Europe is doing to Russia now is having an impact, and it will have an impact internally. And the kind of cost, because, you know, all the military people I'm seeing seem to suggest that maintaining an occupying force in a country that's very happy with you is just not likely to last. So even if they do win the war and stay, it's not likely to last. So although there is the arms race could kind of lead to further conflict, there is also the thought that actually people could look at that conflict and think, well, is it worth it? And it, you know, and so you have, you know, what Kat said at that first time I went, you know, I think it was Death on Delivery. I read this. It was an early Cat publication. The best thing you can hope for arms is they sit in a shed somewhere rotting. So that's kind of what we have to work towards, is if all the governments are increasing their military, we have to make sure they don't damn use them.
The other opportunity there seems to be is to say, actually, humanity's got to the very brink of nuclear war this time, if we don't actually go over it. And it does seem an opportunity for people to reflect, is this in any way a sensible way to go, to have nuclear weapons around the world? And is this after this war, and perhaps people realizing how close we have got to total annihilation, is that a time to say, look, we've got to do something different, we've got to move away from this reliance on nuclear defense?
Yeah, definitely.
Because there was a sort of dreadful complacency in the way that nuclear weapons were being spoken of as just being sort of rather big bombs, instead of being absolutely in a totally different league. And it's a kind of has the potential, I think, as Carrie said, of pulling everyone up very sharply to realizing that just how dangerous they are. Whereas they had been, except for those who were always committed to CND, but for the general way they were spoken of in society, as being just, well, yeah, they're just kind of bigger, but not any more dangerous. I mean, I know we're speaking relatively here, but there is a hope that there at least makes it a little easier for the campaign against nuclear weapons themselves to actually rise much higher in the up the list of priorities. I mean, it was heartening that there's actually an increase in CND membership, which, it's bleak comfort, but it's there. Mike?
Yes, I mean, when I see recently retired generals on the telly talking about the present situation, it seems to me they're absolutely terrified, very aware of the risk of a nuclear war and the fact that it probably could not be contained and would lead to every extermination of humanity, and not just humanity, but so they're absolutely terrified, and that's in a sense heartening. But then we also have to remember, and it's not it's not a counter argument to what I've just said, that the nuclear standoff, the checkmate, not checkmate, the I've forgotten the chess term I want anyway, the standoff, which means they like to think they can't launch nuclear war because each side is going to act rationally within certain lunatic assumptions about nuclear war. Clearly, as Paul Rogers said last week on his talk at Peace News, if what they're saying about Putin is 1/4 right, he's not a rational actor. And perhaps that's why they're so particularly terrified. The other point is that the inability to go to war, if everybody is rational in a nuclear way, allows adventures like Putin's adventure to take place. How could he go to war against, it's because he knows there won't be a nuclear war, that the West won't launch, or he thinks he knows that.
I think that's right.
Very absolutely terrifying, because one way we lose and the other way we lose.
I think that is terrifying, and I think it's what's probably keeping most of us awake at night time. And I think the thing I'm trying to hold on to is that, ironically, it's the worst government we've had in my lifetime are actually doing the right thing. And they're just saying, all this call for protect the skies. And I was just thinking, this is, it's Hobson's choice. It's Hobson's choice. It's like you have to say, we're not going to protect the skies and we know people are going to die, or we protect the skies and risk a nuclear conflict. And the people who are saying, oh, it won't happen, it's like the minute we engage with a Russian fighter, we're in really terrible territory. And I think the fact that nobody is wanting to do that on the West is quite heartening, and a sort of and probably because they know more than we do. But the other thing I think is the possibility, of the threat that he could do this any time, because he just has to threaten it, and then we'll be, oh God, we're a bit worried. But I think what is really interesting is that we could have stopped, like all these people could have been stopped before. Saddam Hussein could have been stopped years before he invaded Kuwait. Hitler could have been stopped years before he invaded Poland. Putin could have been stopped and should have been stopped at Chechnya. And what happened was he was celebrated, he was invited to Buckingham Palace, and it was only a few of us kind of peacey people were sort of saying, you know, he's not such a good guy. And, you know, most of what happened in Chechnya is what we're seeing in Ukraine, and worse. And it was a hidden war. People didn't talk about it. It was, you know, you had to really find that news out about Chechnya. And because the Chechen resistance became such a terrorist organization, that was a gift to Putin, because it was able to sort of demonize them, you know, the whole sort of demonizing thing. But I think what I have actually been heartened by, although I think there are risks to it, is the international response, or certainly the Western response to Putin. And I know, you know, the shame of Britain not really buying into this, but I just think watching French governments and German governments seizing Russian boats and, you know, and insisting on, yeah, we're going to, you know, stop this oil, and we're going to stop the kind of money going into Russia, that is having an impact. And I think that the best we can hope from this is that those wealthy people will not like that happening, and they have some power to disrupt. And I think also, if that, you know, that woman who said on TV last night, she said that there's no war and we can all do this, we shouldn't be afraid, I think was really, really amazing, because again, I don't think any of us have seen this sort of level of protest in Russia for a long time, and it could get worse. I mean, you know, it sounds like they're being very repressive, and, you know, so they could really go back into Stalinist tactics, but at the same time it could get to the point where the people rising up and the oligarchs kind of fearing for their money could actually mean that he won't be able to do an adventure like this again. But I was to say, we could have avoided all this 20 years ago.
Well, gosh. Virginia, you've given us so much food for thought, and we're just enormously grateful to you for just pulling thoughts together after the input that you've given us and that overview, which has left us as a small group, but we have people from Salisbury here, and things ripple out. I think there's such hope in that one small action, or this action of a few people, like that tremendously brave woman, the journalist who stood up with that notice on TV, on Russian television. Just one person, that whatever is done has an effect, and we don't know that effect sometimes, but we still do it because it is the right thing to do, and it is the only thing to do if we believe what we do, what we work for. Thank you. Sally, you were going to mention something at the end.
I think only just to say that the vigil will carry on as long as the war is carrying on. So 8:15 a.m. every Monday morning at the War Memorial.
Just wanted to say that was so wonderful to see that picture on Twitter. It really gave me a boost at seeing it, and so I just sort of say, you know, that's why we do it. Is just that sort of standing there is so important, and the very least I think we can do as well for the people in Russia who are getting arrested is to do that standing there. So, yeah. So it's brilliant that you're doing it, and thank you for doing it. It's inspiring.
Thank you to you, Virginia, and thank you for everyone coming and rippling out what we've been doing so far, what all those in the peace movement have been trying to do so far, and amplifying the voices of those, wherever they are, who are against this Putin's war and the present situation, based on the history that you've given us and the examples that you've given us. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's really lovely to be here, and thank you for asking me. It's nice to see you all again.